soon we'll be designing for walls. So if you want to build one code base that runs just about anywhere, you've got to build it responsively.
Okay, anybody have a counter to doing that?
I can speak on that. So I think responsive is a very generic term, or like it's a very broader term, and there is no one-size-fits-all solution for the web. So every product is different, every use case is different, every team is different. So you have to think on what responsive is needed or what adaptive is needed, or a fusion is needed where both responsive and adaptive come into play. So in eBay, this is what we started. We actually, my boss gave me a project to do there where I got to do a product that works very good in desktop and equally good in tablet. So I went to find out one generic solution, like what is the generic solution or a technique that I can use, that I do that, and then I say to all my eBay fellows that go ahead and do this, and your page automatically becomes beautiful in tablet. But after a long research, I found out there is no such solution, basically. It's like, again, as I told you, everything is different, right? So there are three major categories that I decided finally. One is the responsive, where the client decides everything. CSS is the king there. And the other is adaptive, where the server is the king. It takes which template you need, and you render it to the page. And finally is a fusion, where both the client and server become smart, and they work together to get the most awesome experience that you want. And that's where we ended up finally, for my product at least, where the server gives hints to the client, and the client acts up accordingly, and it renders a very good experience.
Yeah. Bill?
Well, I think it'd be good actually to define responsive and adaptive.
Yeah.
Because if you look at like Luke Grabluski's work on responsive server side, RESS, unfortunately sounds like REST, but it's REST. Watch out for the T. It's responsive server side, which is what we call adaptive. If you look at Aaron Gustafson's work on responsive web design, it's really a subset of what we call responsive, which with breakpoints, right? So I think it'd be helpful to kind of, my definition is the same as yours, that basically, you know, delivering a different experience or adapting a different experience for the channel, in my mind, is much more what adaptive is, whereas responsive is responding to the individual, you know, screen size, the screen rate, you know, all those kind of features of that device, and delivering the same code base and I don't want to say adapting,
right,
but responding. These two words, responsive and adaptive, are so close together.
It was actually this definition that led me to, you know, because I'm kind of getting stressed about doing this meetup, because it seems like we've got to define those things. And as you start diving into that space and try to figure out, there is no definition.
That's
so
right.
one of the things let me put out one that you guys can tear down.
Yep.
Let's say that responsive is, see, the thing is, if you describe responsive in a kind of contained way, then of course it's the fail, right? It's the wrong way to do it. Right. So for example, some of the bad side of responsive, if you think about it, is it just hiding assets and adding assets via CSS, and the base HTML template's the same, then you got that whole problem with the mobile device getting too much of a load that's never going to use these components, right? So I kind of think of that as responsive. I think of responsive as kind of a dumb solution in the sense that it's only the client side doing anything. Of course, the CSS is going to pull different assets out, or the page is going to render different assets. Do you guys think it's something different than that?
That's true, pretty much. What you explained is true.
Okay.
So I guess I would just point out that prior to our responsive redesign, we did something that I would consider adaptive that was entirely client-side. We were working with a third party that took the markup that we generated for each page and was able to detect what device it was on and serve up a completely different experience. So I guess if I were to define the differences, I would take a step away from the technology and say that adaptive is a different experience for a different device type, and responsive is predominantly the same code base. And then we can argue in the gray area about how much adaptation you're doing server-side and stuff like that.
It's interesting because you started by talking about team size and team influence, and that is another question. Like, if you have two different teams, clearly that's not responsive development, right? Because it's two different code bases completely. But at the same time, if the teams are making components and there's someone stitching stuff together, like Yahoo's doing quite a bit, I think, then you start questioning where that space is. So let's move into something that we can all kind of agree on. If you think of the more rudimentary description of responsive, where is it failing right now? Who wants to take this?
Well, to me, I'd just like to point out that I agree with you guys that it depends a lot on the business needs and technical feasibility as well. I think it's important to also value the good sides of responsive web design. To me, it makes a lot of sense when you want to have your page that is fluid and responsive, within the same device. So for instance, if you have a desktop and you want a completely different look when you resize the viewport, then to me, responsive web design makes a lot of sense. The same thing about when you change your orientation of your device. For instance, you might want to use media queries and do all kinds of different stuff. However, I think that based on different devices, responsive web design fails just because of, we might want to serve a better experience or a different experience that sometimes might require a lot of markup changes.
Well, I think too, you have to define the type of experience you're trying to create, right? Because if it's a content-based site, where the UI, basically the content is the UI, then responsive is really great for that. Lots of, publishing sites, blogs, blah, blah, blah.
Websites, not apps.
Websites, not apps, right? Versus an app. And of course, there's a total gray area there because we mix the two all the time. But just cut it real fine. If you do that, you say, well, if you got a content site, you probably should just go ahead and say, I'm going to do responsive. But then you start thinking through it with your experience on channels, or maybe something else you want to do there, right? And so you might break from responsive. If you got an application, you're probably going to have different modes of use from users, as they access a mobile device or a handheld small mobile device versus a tablet, and then you want to optimize around that.
Okay. Well, yeah, go ahead.
So this is very similar to what we did in eBay, is that we came to an assumption that if you're consuming a lot of information, it's basically a consumption website, then responsive makes sense. But if you're going to interact with the website a lot, like you're going to maintain a state in that page and things like that, then adaptive comes into place. And there are a lot of pages where there is minimalistic.
Raptor, do you want to describe that? Did you say Raptor comes into place?
No, adaptive. Adaptive.
Thank you.
Yeah, and the last is the fusion, right? Like a lot of websites fall into some middle category where there is one user interaction, and there's not much of other stuff, and that's why we use fusion, or it's called REST, I think, responsive web design and server-side components. So that's where that comes into place. So it's again a call that you make based on your product.
Okay, let me ask you this. Let's talk about websites for a second, not applications. Of course, there's a gray area, but let's talk about websites. Do you think there's ever a reason to do a mobile versus a desktop version that are different, like totally different code bases? Is there ever a reason to do that?
I always like to answer those questions with two ways. It depends in both, but which doesn't make a great panel debate. I think the 95% rule is you're right. I think there's probably a 5% out there.
Yeah,
You can't imagine doing it that way.
can't. I'm sure that there's probably an exception out there, but let me just say that I actually agree, which is going to make this a very interesting debate. We
can argue the nuances.
That's right, we can. Cool.
Instead of polar opposite artificial positions.
So what sets Zazzle apart from the eBays of the world is we do customized products. So the product page itself is very interactive. You get to touch, you get to play with what you're doing, the changes that you're making.
I'd say you definitely float more on the app side than the website
Very
side.
much so, yeah. So the product page itself is an interesting problem for us, and we are definitely looking into how to make the experience better using native apps, which would very much be an adaptive experience.
I'm sorry, you said what, using native apps?
Native apps on the devices. We're also spending a lot of time trying to figure out how to make the website respond effectively at a variety of screen sizes. So I guess one of the business issues to keep in mind is that if you do email campaigns, that traffic is going to go straight to a website. You're going to have trouble opening a native app. So you better have a website that works. Otherwise, you're potentially losing a lot of potential revenue. So the native apps in particular for very rich experience make a ton of sense, but you need to have some sort of a fallback that works on the website.
Speaking of revenue, one of the interesting points that when we talk about responsive web design at Yahoo is advertisement, right? We need to make sure that the ads are ready for a responsive web page. And we discovered that actually it's pretty much in the early stages. So sometimes we really want to do something responsive in the same device, and it's just impossible because the ad will still be there. So that's why I said in the beginning that depends a lot on the business cases and technical feasibility. I actually did a little research on the, what's the name of the thing?
RES.
Interactive Advertising Bureau. where they set the formats and recommendations about responsive web design. And they actually wrote a document pretty good, and they talk a lot about that, where they have like different kinds of ads that basically usually comes down to stretching the ad and hiding stuff and things like that. So basically making it flexible, and or swapping completely the content based on the viewport size or device that you are. The problem for the ads is that usually they have a problem with packaging and the way to track the ad, because if you just say, okay, resize the viewports, then now the ad will be somewhere hidden from the user. So that's a pretty significant problem.
This is about ad delivery services, though, right? I mean, you
Yeah.
could theoretically ask for ads that were the size and space you needed. I mean, I think a lot of this kind of stuff is. One of the things that I've found stunning is that all of you are like, no, responsive, absolutely. You wouldn't do a desktop and a mobile app, website separately, and yet that's most of the websites out there that are doing mobile, right? There's a secondary. You can tell from the URL space. So why is it that people are doing that, and why aren't the ads catching up to that? I mean, the ad question, of course, is can you do revenue capture? Password. Through ads. So I guess we're in two different spaces here. First off, why are so many? Just stay on that. We'll go back to ads possibly. Why are so many people, so many developers doing two sites?
There was a lot of reasons for it. One could be organizationally. You have a separate mobile team, you got a separate web team. The web team's not really thought about mobile. That was PayPal's history. They divided mobile and web apart. And then they had this horrible legacy technical debt, that made it impossible to change anything, which we thankfully are now fixing with Node and other cool stuff. But, it's like we had a m.PayPal. We still have m.PayPal totally sucked. I mean,
Does
sorry.
it still?
Yeah. But we've got to, well, if you go to paypal.com now, you get a responsive experience, right? It's really kind of adaptive. But it looks like the website. It's not quite done totally responsive, but it's the same content, right? Delivered just a little bit more efficiently. So that's much better than it was. But the m.PayPal hung around for a long time because of the organizational differences and because of the technical debt to change it. And then when we first, a lot of my UI engineers, some of them are here, were proposing responsive and adaptive ideas to the design team in 2011, early 2012. They got a big pushback because the designers said, what is that and why we want to do it? Which blew my mind because 2011, 2012, I thought everybody kind of knew that in the design space. So you got a lot of people who actually didn't know how to do this or didn't know it even existed, which again surprised me. So there's a whole bunch of reasons, from talent to organization to...
Anybody else have an opinion on this?
Yeah, I have a point. So if you build a pure responsive as per definition, right, you will definitely not able to provide a world-class experience in a tablet or a mobile device. I mean, obvious reasons being, right, like basically if it's responsive, JavaScript cannot be intelligent enough. The reason being, you have to attach click events, for example, and click is delayed by 300 milliseconds in a tablet device. And there is no native swiping in our desktop world, right?
That's what touch start is for.
Yeah, so in that case, you got to send that library to the client, right? And that's where you do a little bit of adaptiveness already in the server. So, and there are a lot of other things, right? Like when you're in a tablet device, swipe comes to you very naturally. And if you got to, it means that your page should have a swipe library rendered as a response. And that means your server should know either it sends a swipe library in the desktop mode also, or it sends it only in the tablet mode. That's again a question. So what is the experience you want to give to your users is what matters. So for example, eBay can have like 100 pages, but not all 100 pages need to be exactly working like great in a tablet world. It's like 1 or 2 pages, like a search page or things like that, where users have to swipe through. That's where I think I'll make a fork in my code saying that, okay, the request comes, I know this is from a tablet or this is from a mobile, then use my different template instead of the actual template that comes for desktop version. Because that is my meat of my application. And I want the meat of the application to look really solid, really to work well. And nowadays, like there's a big war on the mobile side also between native and HTML5 apps, right? So if you really want to win that war, you got to provide at least a little bit of good experience to the tablet or the mobile users, rather than just making a responsive website. I think that would be one of the reasons that a lot of websites are doing that.
Yeah, I think another reason is because they haven't actually thought mobile first, right? So if you actually try to take some of these clunky websites and you were to even try to apply some nice media queries and CSS, you've got all this crap that it's not gonna fit. It's gonna stack down and be 100 miles long when you
So,
scroll
so
it.
you think if you're starting from greenfield, you do mobile first, then of
Yeah.
course it makes sense to keep the same code base and do
For a
responsive as much as
website, maybe
possible.
responsive, yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.